Disney movie villains have shaped our notions of evil for generations. However, not all of them have the same bombastic, flamboyant, and larger than life natures that thrive on villainy. In fact, there has been a rise and fall in terms of how vile versus how tame they tend to be over the decades, depending on the audience that's watching them. In the beginning, Disney movie villains tended to be horrifying in contrast to the saturating worlds they inhabited. The contrast made their heroes' successes truer in the face of such horror. In the 1940s, the villain ratio was reduced due to a transition to more lighthearted fare as stories were generated towards more accepted popular family views rather than a timeless quality. In spite of this, there were some frightening villains that would appear every now and then, but there were also some unpleasant ones that were not as dark as those exceptions. In the 1950s, there were villains that were a mix of silly yet threatening behaviors, realistically scary in the psychological aspect, being betrayed realistically with no attempt to soften them, or one being subtle with the occasional bout of emotional villainy. Starting in the 60s, the villains would take a more comedic turn, starting off as somewhat threatening, but gradually being dealt with in more and more lighthearted manners than their predecessors. By the 1970s, villains were utterly incompetent and comedic, as the stories focused on them were safer and less full of peril. The last of these from this era was the beginning of a return to the darker origins of their villainy. The 1980s saw villains become more intimidating once more, with darker personalities than before. Some of these villains were terrifying to the point of inflicting emotional trauma long after the film had ended. Others were low-key in their villainy, but were darkly realistic in terms of their actions. And there was one seemingly comedic, but hiding a violent and horrifying nature. During the Disney Renaissance, it saw the rise of Disney villains that were intimidating, but also having a larger-than-life personality that went alongside with their villainous nature, accenting it and escalating the memorability of the character. In addition to this, there were villains that were utterly no nonsense, mature, and darkly realistic in their portrayals compared to their more fantastical predecessors. Villains began to take turns to less showboating natures in the 2000s due to their hero counterparts being more complex, with one comedic exception. As a result, they were less interesting and bland and forgettable. In the beginning of the Disney revival era, we saw villains of the bland, forgettable nature, but also villains that were memorable in the terms of the Disney Renaissance. However, there's been a trend lately with Disney villains being revealed as villains only in their last third, after being portrayed as a relatively good guy prior to this reveal. And in the reverse, there was one antagonistic force being revealed as a corrupted version of a benevolent force, with an obvious villain turning as a bait and switch red herring. And there's even villains that were created by the heroes unwittingly and dealt with in sort of quick and emotional manners that did not involve a typical good versus evil conflict. It's unknown where Disney villains will be heading in the future, but hopefully it'll be towards the memorable villainy that we associate them with. This is Grimoire666. Like and subscribe.